Welcome to our channel, Crime Loom, the place where true crime stories come alive. From daring jewel heists to mysterious legends, every video uncovers the secrets hidden in the shadows. Stay with us, because here, every crime tells a story. Deep, suspenseful narrator tone, slow build-up. Some crimes hide in shadows for years, some secrets sleep in silence, waiting to be uncovered, and some truths take decades before finally being exposed. Music rises, police sirens glow, AI graphics flicker. For 19 years, the case stayed cold, until the power of AI revealed what human eyes had missed. Fast flashes, handcuffs close up, police lights, digital DNA graphics. This is Crime Loom, where cold cases are unraveled, where technology meets truth, and where justice comes alive, no matter how long it takes. The night was cold and quiet in the small town of Ridgefield, Virginia. The streets were nearly empty, with only a few cars moving under the pale glow of street lamps. At the edge of town, near an old warehouse that had been abandoned for years, the silence was broken. A young woman named Laura Bennett never returned home that night. She was only 24 years old, full of energy, dreams, and kindness, but her life was about to end in a way that would haunt the community for decades. Laura had left her friend's house around 9 in the evening. She carried her small purse, walked toward her car, and told her friend she would call once she reached home. That call never came. Hours later, her family grew worried when she did not answer her phone. Her parents, Henry and Margaret Bennett, stayed awake through the night, hoping to hear the sound of the front door. But the house remained silent. By the next morning, her disappearance was reported to the police. Detective Harold Grant was one of the first to take the call. He was experienced, a man who had worked on many difficult cases. Alongside him was his partner, Detective Linda Monroe, who had only been in the department a few years but carried a sharp mind and determination. Both arrived at the Bennett home to speak with the family. They listened to Henry and Margaret describe Laura as responsible and caring. She was not the type to disappear without telling anyone. Her younger brother, Daniel, sat on the couch, silent and pale, unable to process the fear. The search began immediately. Officers checked the roads, called hospitals, and spoke to neighbors. By evening, they found Laura's car parked near the abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The driver's door was unlocked. Her purse was inside, but her phone was gone. Fear grew heavier as the hours passed. 2 days later, a local boy riding his bike past the warehouse made a chilling discovery. Laura's body lay hidden in a corner near the broken fence. The police rushed to the scene. Harold and Linda stood near the crime tape, looking down at her lifeless form. The air was heavy with sorrow and anger. The warehouse, already filled with shadows, now carried a darker memory. The crime scene team worked quickly. They collected samples, took photographs, and searched for any sign of the person responsible. Rain had fallen the night before, washing away footprints and smudging any traces of evidence. A small amount of blood was collected, but it was unclear if it belonged to Laura or someone else. Pieces of fabric were found near the fence, but they offered no clear answers. The warehouse had been abandoned for years, filled with trash, graffiti, and broken glass, making the search even harder. Detectives interviewed people in the area. Some claimed they saw a man walking near the warehouse that night. Others said they heard a car drive away quickly. The descriptions did not match. One person thought the man had dark hair. Another said he was bald. One said he was tall. Another insisted he was short. The details clashed and confused the investigation. Among the people questioned was a local man named Eric Turner. He lived not far from the warehouse and had been seen in the area before. He had a history of petty crimes, but nothing violent. When asked about the night Laura disappeared, he gave vague answers. He said he was home, then changed his story and said he was at a bar. The detectives felt uneasy about him, but without solid proof, they could not hold him. The town of Ridgefield was shaken. News spread quickly, and fear settled in the hearts of neighbors. Parents told their children not to walk alone at night. People locked their doors earlier than usual. At the funeral, the church was filled with silence and tears. Laura's friends placed flowers on her coffin, and her parents stood broken at the front row. Daniel, her brother, clenched his fists, too young to understand why the world had taken his sister, but old enough to feel the weight of her absence. Detective Harold Grant promised the family they would find answers. He meant every word, but deep down, he feared the challenges ahead. Evidence was thin, the crime scene was compromised, and witnesses contradicted one another. The case had started with urgency, but as weeks turned into months, it slowed. Leads dried up, tips grew cold, and hope began to fade. The detectives did their best. They sent the blood sample for testing, but the technology at the time was not advanced enough to give clear results. They reviewed the blurry footage from a gas station camera near the warehouse, but the figure walking past could not be identified. They brought Eric Turner in for more questioning, but every time his lawyer defended him strongly. Without hard proof, they had no choice but to let him walk free. As the investigation struggled, the Bennett family grew desperate. Margaret often called the station asking if there was progress. Henry went door to door, handing out flyers, begging for anyone with information to come forward. Daniel grew quiet, keeping his pain hidden, but his eyes carried the sorrow of someone who had lost more than he could bear. Months passed, then years. The case file grew thick with papers, but thin with hope. The once bright faces of detectives grew weary when the subject of Laura Bennett came up. The town moved on, but the family never did. For them, every day was a reminder of the daughter and sister who never came home. Eric Turner continued to live in Ridgefield for a few more years before moving to Ohio. To many, he was just another man starting over. To the Bennetts, he remained, a shadow of suspicion, a name that haunted their nights. But suspicion was not enough for justice. By the end of the first year, the case was officially declared cold. Laura's picture hung on the wall of unsolved cases at the police station, her smile frozen in time. For the family, for the detectives, and for the community, the story was far from over. They did not know it yet, but 19 years later, the truth would come back to the surface, carried not by human memory, but by a new kind of intelligence. The Bennett family never recovered from the loss of their daughter. Every year on the date of Laura's death, her parents lit a candle by the window, hoping the glow would somehow guide her spirit back home. Henry often sat on the porch in silence, staring at the street where she once walked. Margaret carried her daughter's necklace in her pocket everywhere she went. Daniel, who was only 15 at the time of Laura's murder, grew up with anger buried inside him. The town, however, slowly moved on. At first, neighbors spoke about Laura's case often, whispering about the young man, Eric Turner, and whether he might have been guilty. But as months passed and no arrest was made, the conversations grew fewer. New crimes, new scandals, and everyday life pushed the memory aside. Only the Bennett family and the detectives carried the weight year after. Detective Harold Grant still felt the case like a stone in his chest. He had seen many crimes before, but something about Laura's murder cut deeper. Maybe it was the way the family looked at him with desperate eyes. Maybe it was the way Daniel's silence spoke louder than words. Linda Monroe, his partner, felt it too. She often revisited the case file, reading and rereading the notes, as if the truth might appear one day between the lines. But the truth stayed hidden. Eric Turner built a new life for himself. At first, he stayed in Ridgefield, avoiding questions and blending into the background. After 5 years, he moved to Ohio, where no one knew his name or his past. He found work under a different company, rented a small house, and introduced himself to neighbors as just another ordinary man. People who met him thought he was quiet, even polite. They had no idea he had once been the focus of a murder investigation. Back in Ridgefield, the Bennetts struggled with grief that never faded. Margaret sometimes visited the warehouse where Laura's body was found. She stood outside the broken fence, holding her daughter's necklace, whispering prayers into the wind. Henry spent long hours at his workshop, building wooden boxes and furniture to keep his mind occupied. Daniel grew into adulthood with the memory of his sister shaping every choice he made. He never forgave the police for failing to bring her justice. The years turned into decades. Technology advanced, but the file of Laura Bennett remained in the cold case drawer. Old evidence sat in boxes, untouched. The blood samples degraded further. The blurry gas station video grew more useless with every year. Witnesses moved away, and memories faded. It seemed as if the case would remain unsolved forever. But 19 years after that tragic night, a new program was launched by the state. A task force was created to reopen unsolved crimes using new tools. Artificial intelligence had begun to play a role in investigations. Computer systems could now analyze DNA that once seemed unusable. They could enhance old video footage, sharpen blurry images, and even study the patterns in conflicting witness statements. What human eyes could not see, the machine could. Detective Samuel Price was assigned to the task force. He was younger than Harold Grant had been when the case first opened, but he carried the same determination. Samuel believed in using every resource possible. Alongside him was Chloe Martin, a data analyst in her 20s who understood the language of machines better than most. She believed that AI could give voices back to victims who had been silent for too long. When Samuel opened the cold case files, he paused at the name Laura Bennett. Something about the photograph of the young woman struck him. Her smile, her eyes, the life she had ahead of her. All stolen too soon. He decided this was the case he wanted to bring back to life. Chloe agreed, and together they carried the old boxes into their office. Dust rose from the cardboard as if the past itself resisted being disturbed. Inside were photographs of the warehouse, police notes, faded receipts, and bags of evidence. The blood samples were sealed, but old notes warned they were too degraded to test. The VHS tape from the gas station camera was also included. Samuel held it in his hands, knowing that to the original investigators it had been nearly useless. But to Chloe, it was a challenge. She fed the footage into the AI system, and the computer began working frame by frame, sharpening, cleaning, and rebuilding lost pixels. At the same time, DNA analysts used new technology to recover information from the degraded samples. What had been impossible in the past was now possible with advanced systems. The AI also scanned the old witness statements. It searched for connections, patterns, and contradictions. Within days, the case that had seemed empty for 19 years began to breathe again. While the system worked, Samuel visited the Bennetts. Henry and Margaret were older now, their hair gray and their faces lined with sorrow. Daniel, now in his 30s, greeted the detective with suspicion. He had lost faith in promises long ago. But when Samuel explained that new technology might finally uncover the truth, hope flickered in Margaret's eyes. She held her daughter's necklace tightly and whispered, "Please, please don't let her be forgotten again." Samuel promised. He would try. He knew better than to guarantee results, but he felt something stirring. For the first time in years, there was movement in Laura's case. Back at the office, Chloe called Samuel over. On the screen, the once blurry gas station footage now showed a clearer image. A man was walking near the warehouse around the time Laura disappeared. His face was still hard to identify fully, but the AI highlighted a detail the old detectives had missed. A scar on the man's left hand. Samuel leaned closer. Didn't one of the old suspects have something like that? Chloe pulled up the file. Eric Turner. Questioned, released, never charged. The notes mentioned a scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. Samuel felt his pulse quicken. After 19 years, the shadow of suspicion had returned. DNA results came back a week later. The degraded sample found near the warehouse was processed by the new system. The AI reconstructed missing data, filling in the gaps with advanced algorithms. The result was shocking. The DNA matched Eric Turner. 19 years had passed, but science had caught up to the truth. For the first time since Laura's death, the investigators had something solid. Not only suspicion, but proof. Eric Turner, the man who had walked away free almost 2 decades ago, was once again at the center of the case. The Bennetts received the news with tears and trembling hands. Henry sat in silence. Margaret sobbed into her hands, and Daniel clenched his jaw. After all these years, the name they had whispered in anger was finally spoken again by the police as a suspect. The case was no longer cold. It was alive, and this time, the truth would not stay hidden. 19 years is a long time to wait for justice. In those years, memories fade, people move away, and the world changes. But for the Bennetts, time had not erased anything. Their daughter's face was still fresh in their minds. The scar of loss was still sharp in their hearts. When the detectives told them about the AI breakthrough, it was as if the past had suddenly come alive again. Margaret Bennett sat at her kitchen table that night, staring at Laura's necklace in her hand. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Maybe this is the sign we've been waiting for." Henry placed his hand on hers, steady but tired. He had lived with the burden of not protecting his daughter for 19 years, and though he said little, his silence spoke of the storm inside him. Daniel, Laura's younger brother, felt anger more than relief. He had grown up resenting the system. He often told himself that the world had let his sister down. Now, with Eric Turner's name back in the air, his anger burned even hotter. If they had done their job back then, he told his parents, Laura would have had justice years ago. He could not stop himself from imagining how different their lives might have been if Eric had been caught right away. Detective Samuel Price understood the pressure on the family. He also knew that one piece of DNA and a scar in a video were not enough to close the case. He needed more. Chloe Martin, the young analyst, worked day and night on the AI system. She enhanced the video even further, slowed it down, and isolated frames that revealed the figure's walk, posture, and build. Everything pointed toward Eric Turner, but suspicion had failed the police before. This time, Samuel wanted a case so strong that no lawyer could tear it apart. He began by reopening interviews with witnesses who had been questioned 19 years earlier. Some were harder to find now. People had moved, changed numbers, or even passed away. But those who were still around were surprised when detectives knocked on their doors again. One of the witnesses, a man named Kevin Ross, remembered something he had never told the police before. Back then, he had seen Eric near the warehouse on the night Laura disappeared, but fear kept him quiet. Eric had a reputation in town as someone who could be dangerous when angry. Kevin admitted that he had lied to avoid trouble. Now, after so many years, he felt guilty for staying silent. Another witness, a woman named Linda Clark, confessed that she too had been afraid. She had seen a man matching Eric's description near the gas station, but she convinced herself it was safer to keep her mouth shut. Hearing about the AI evidence gave her courage to speak. For the first time, her words matched the data. Piece by piece, the puzzle began to rebuild itself. Samuel felt the weight of progress. He knew that every detail mattered, especially with so much time passed. He contacted Eric's old employer, hoping to find old records or files that might place him near the warehouse that night. Surprisingly, one document showed Eric had left work early on the evening of Laura's disappearance, but his reason for leaving had never been verified. Meanwhile, Chloe continued digging into the old surveillance tape. She noticed something unusual in the background, a car parked near the warehouse, partly hidden in the shadows. The AI system compared the car's shape and features with vehicles registered in the area at that time. The result matched a car once owned by Eric Turner. It was an old model, but its unique shape was clear in the footage. Another thread tied him to the crime scene. Back in Ohio, Eric Turner lived under the name Martin Cole. He worked in a warehouse and kept a quiet life. Neighbors described him as ordinary, a man who kept to himself. No one knew his past. No one suspected that the man who smiled politely at the grocery store was carrying a secret from nearly 2 decades ago. Samuel decided it was time to start surveillance on Eric. Officers followed him to work, to the store, and back to his small house. They watched his habits. He lived simply, never drawing attention. But Samuel knew a calm life could hide a dark history. The scar on Eric's left hand, the one the AI had caught in the old video, was still there. The detectives managed to capture photographs of it when he reached for groceries one evening. At the same time, DNA testing continued. The AI had matched the degraded sample to Eric, but Samuel wanted confirmation from another source. They obtained a discarded coffee cup from a trash bin outside Eric's workplace. The DNA from the cup was tested against the old sample. The results came back as a perfect match. This was no longer a shadow of suspicion. This was proof. When Samuel met the Bennetts again, he told them about the progress. Margaret broke into tears. Henry closed his eyes in silence, and Daniel stood stiffly with his arms crossed. "So what now?" Daniel asked sharply. Samuel explained that with DNA, video, and witness statements, they were building a case strong, enough to bring Eric to court. But patience was still needed. Every step had to be careful. Every detail had to be correct. Eric himself began to notice changes. Strange cars parked near his street. People watching too closely. He felt eyes on him when he walked to his car. One evening, he called an old friend and complained, "Feels like someone's following me again." His voice carried nervousness. He had escaped once, but now the past was pressing down on him. 19 years after Laura Bennett's life was stolen, the investigation was alive again. The AI had turned shadows into shapes, blurred images into faces, and broken data into solid proof. Detectives who once carried guilt now felt a spark of hope. For the Bennetts, justice was no longer a dream. It was coming closer with each passing day. But the closer the police came to Eric, the more dangerous things became. A man who had lived with a secret for 19 years was not likely to give up easily. Samuel knew this case was far from over. The breakthrough was only the beginning of a chase that would test both human patience and the power of machines. Detective Samuel Price sat in his office late at night, the glow of his desk lamp the only light in the room. The files of Laura Bennett's case were spread out in front of him. On one side were the faded reports from 19 years ago, on the other side the fresh AI-generated images and DNA results. It felt as if two different worlds were colliding, the old world of human error and lost opportunities, and the new world where machines could bring clarity to the past. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He knew they had enough to move forward, but he also knew that courts demanded more than suspicion. Every piece of evidence had to connect smoothly. Eric Turner had walked away once. Samuel would not allow it to happen again. Meanwhile, Chloe Martin continued working. Long hours with the AI system. She tested old audio files from 911 calls, enhanced background noises, and re-examined witness statements. The AI flagged similarities in phrasing between two different witnesses, showing that both had likely seen the same man but described him differently out of fear. This connection had gone unnoticed years ago. Now it pointed directly back to Eric. Samuel decided it was time to confront Eric indirectly. Officers began speaking with people in Eric's Ohio neighborhood. They asked about his routines, his behavior, and his past. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, and ordinary. One woman, however, remembered a strange moment. She said Eric once snapped when a teenager accidentally hit his car with a bicycle. His face changed in an instant, she recalled. It was like another person was inside him. That flash of anger reminded Samuel that calm exteriors could hide violent histories. As surveillance continued, police collected more discarded items from Eric: coffee cups, water bottles, even a cigarette butt. Each DNA test confirmed the match with the old sample from the warehouse. The results grew stronger with every test. The case was tightening around him. Back in Ridgefield, the Bennetts struggled with the emotions of waiting. Margaret prayed every night that justice would finally come. Henry, now older and quieter, said little, but his eyes showed both exhaustion and determination. Daniel, full of restless anger, often asked Samuel why they could not arrest Eric immediately. Samuel explained that patience was vital. "If we move too fast," he told Daniel, "we risk losing him again. This time we need to make it impossible for him to escape." Chloe's work with the AI revealed another critical detail. In the enhanced footage from the gas station, the AI detected not just the scar on Eric's hand, but also the faint reflection of a necklace in his pocket. When compared with photos, it appeared similar to the necklace Laura wore the night she disappeared. While this detail alone could not convict him, it added another thread to the web tightening around him. At the same time, Samuel searched for old connections in Eric's life. He spoke to Eric's former employer from 19 years ago, who admitted that Eric left work early on the night of Laura's disappearance. The reason he gave was vague, something about not feeling well. No one had verified it at the time. Now, paired with the AI evidence, it became a crucial piece of the timeline. The grand jury was briefed with the new findings. They listened to Samuel's presentation, the DNA match, the enhanced video, the witness testimony, and the AI analysis of patterns. One juror leaned forward and said, "This is stronger than anything we've seen before." Approval was given to reopen the case formally. It was the step Samuel had been waiting for. News of the reopened case spread quietly through Ridgefield. Some of the older residents remembered Laura and spoke of her with sadness. Younger people, who were children when it happened, learned the story for the first time. Whispers filled diners, grocery stores, and church halls. They say it was Eric all along. 19 years. Can you imagine? The community felt the old wound reopen, but this time with a chance for healing. Eric himself noticed the pressure closing in. He sensed eyes watching him everywhere he went. He grew nervous, snapping at coworkers, keeping his curtains closed at home. At night, he walked back and forth in his living room, muttering to himself. He had lived with his secret for 19 years, but now it felt like the walls were closing in. Detectives continued surveillance. One evening, they recorded Eric sitting on his porch, holding his head in his hands. He whispered, "They'll never prove it. They can't prove it." The recording was faint, but it revealed his growing fear. Meanwhile, Samuel visited the Bennetts again. This time, he brought encouraging news. He explained that the case was moving forward and that Eric would soon face charges. Margaret held his hands tightly and whispered, "Please don't let him walk away this time." Daniel stood in the corner, his fists clenched. Henry gave a quiet nod, his eyes shining with restrained tears. As the police prepared the final steps, Chloe noticed one last piece of information. The AI detected that the car seen near the warehouse 19 years ago had a unique dent on the rear bumper. Records showed that Eric's car had the same dent, noted in a repair document from a shop he visited weeks later. It was another link, another nail in the coffin. With DNA proof, enhanced video, witness testimony, and the car evidence, Samuel knew they had a case that could no longer be ignored. The time to act had come. Early in the morning, as the sun began to rise, officers prepared for the operation. They put on protective vests, checked their radios, and surrounded Eric's small house in Ohio. The street was silent except for the soft hum of engines. Samuel stood at the front, calm but determined. After 19 years, justice was finally within reach. The knock on the door was loud and sharp. Eric froze inside, his heart pounding. The past he had buried was now standing at his front door. He looked around his small living room, his mind racing. The knock came again, followed by a voice, "Police! Open the door!" Eric's world, built on years of hiding, was about to collapse. The morning air was heavy with tension. Police vehicles lined the quiet street near Eric Turner's home. Officers moved carefully into position, surrounding the small house that looked so ordinary from the outside. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, confused and curious. To them, Eric had always seemed like just another quiet man. Few could imagine the secret he had carried for nearly 2 decades. Detective Samuel Price stood near the front, radio in hand. He gave a nod to the officers. The pounding knock shook the door again, followed by the warning, "Police, open up!" Inside, Eric froze. His heart raced as he looked around his living room. His eyes darted toward the back door, then to the window, but officers were already outside. There was no escape. For a moment, he considered staying silent. But the second knock was louder, stronger, and the command more urgent. Slowly, Eric opened the door. His face was pale, his hands trembling. Officers ordered him to step outside. He hesitated, his eyes flicking left and right as if searching for a way out. Then, with a defeated look, he stepped onto the porch. "Eric Turner," Samuel said firmly, "you are under arrest for the murder of Laura Bennett." Eric's eyes widened at the name. It was a name he had not heard spoken to him in years, but one he had never been able to forget. For a brief moment, his lips parted as if to argue, but no words came. Officers moved in, handcuffs clicked around his wrists, and he was led down the steps. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence. The quiet man they had known was being taken away for a crime committed 19 years ago. At the station, Eric sat in an interrogation room. The walls felt smaller with every passing second. He tried to keep calm, but sweat formed on his forehead. Samuel entered the room, followed by another officer. They sat across from him, placing files on the table. Samuel's voice was steady but firm. "We have DNA evidence, Eric. The sample from the warehouse matches you. Not just once, but several times. We also have video footage enhanced with AI. It shows a man with your scar on his left hand near the scene that night. Witnesses are now willing to speak, and the car seen near the warehouse matches yours. You can sit here and deny it, but the evidence is clear." Eric's eyes dropped to the table. For years, he had told himself the truth would never come out. He had convinced himself that time would bury the crime forever. But now, with every detail laid before him, he felt the weight of 19 years pressing down. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he whispered at last. His voice cracked under the pressure. Samuel leaned forward. "Then tell us what happened. After 19 years, don't you think her family deserves the truth?" Eric swallowed hard, his shoulders sinking. Slowly, he began to speak. He said he had seen Laura walking near the warehouse that night. He admitted they had argued after he made unwanted advances, and she tried to walk away. In a burst of anger, he struck her. He claimed he panicked when she collapsed. Fear drove him to drag her body to the side of the warehouse and leave her there. He insisted it was never planned, but his words carried little comfort. The damage was done, and a young woman's life had been stolen. His confession was recorded. The room was silent except for his trembling words. Samuel sat still, listening carefully. There was no satisfaction in hearing the details, only a grim confirmation of what had long been suspected. Back in Ridgefield, the Bennetts were told of the arrest. Margaret collapsed into tears the moment she heard the words. Henry, usually silent, finally let out a sob that had been trapped for 19 years. Daniel clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. He felt anger, sadness, and relief all at once. After so many years, the man who had stolen his sister's life was finally caught. The news spread through the town quickly. For older residents, it was like reopening an old wound. They remembered the fear, the unanswered questions, and the whispers of suspicion. Now the whispers turned into gasps of disbelief. "It really was Eric all along," people said in hushed voices. The man who had lived among them, smiling politely, had been hiding a terrible truth. Eric's arrest became a national headline. The story of a 19-year-old murder, solved with artificial intelligence, captured the attention of the media. Reporters described it as proof that technology could give justice to families who had waited far too long. Some called it a miracle of science, while others debated the growing power of AI. For the Bennetts, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that their daughter's name was finally connected to justice. As Eric sat in his cell awaiting trial, his mind replayed the night again and again. He had run from the truth for 19 years, but the truth had found him. The scar on his hand, the DNA in the dirt, the blurred video, things he thought were too weak to matter, had come back with strength. Samuel visited the Bennetts again, sitting at their kitchen table just as Harold Grant and Linda Monroe had done years before. But this time, he did not come with empty hands. He came with answers. He explained the evidence, the confession, and the next steps. Margaret wept openly, clutching Laura's necklace against her chest. Henry's hand shook as he reached across the table to squeeze Samuel's arm. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Daniel, however, was not satisfied. "Why did it take 19 years?" he demanded. His voice was sharp, filled with the anger of a lifetime. Samuel looked him in the eye and answered calmly, "Because 19 years ago, the tools we needed didn't exist, but now they do. And because of that, Laura finally has justice." The words did not erase Daniel's pain, but they gave him something he had never had before: closure. As the sun set that evening, Margaret lit the candle by the window as she had done every year since her daughter's death. But this time, her tears were mixed with relief. She whispered into the quiet air, "We found him, Laura. We finally found him." And for the first time in 19 years, the Bennetts felt the faint glow of peace returning to their home. The courtroom was silent as Eric Turner was led inside, his wrists bound in handcuffs. The man who had lived quietly in Ohio for years now faced the world with cameras pointed at him and reporters whispering his name. His face was pale, his steps slow, and his eyes never rose from the floor. After 19 years of hiding, the past had finally caught him, and there was no escape left. The Bennetts sat together on the front bench. Margaret clutched Laura's necklace tightly in her hand. Henry sat beside her, stiff and heavy with emotion. Daniel sat on the other side, his fists pressed against his knees. They had waited nearly 2 decades for this moment. They had pictured it countless times in their minds, and now it was real. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The trial began with the prosecution laying out their case. The lawyer stood tall, speaking clearly to the jury. "This is not just about evidence," he said. "This is about a young woman named Laura Bennett whose life was stolen 19 years ago, and it is about the man sitting before you who believed he could bury the truth forever. But the truth has returned." The prosecution presented the enhanced video footage first. The jury watched as the blurry shapes from years ago sharpened into clearer figures. A man walked near the warehouse on the night Laura disappeared. His hand, caught briefly in the light, revealed the scar that matched Eric Turner's. The jury leaned forward, watching carefully. Then came the DNA evidence. Scientists explained how the degraded samples from the warehouse had once been thought useless. They showed how artificial intelligence rebuilt the missing data, creating a complete profile. They compared it to the DNA taken from Eric's discarded coffee cup. The match was undeniable. The probability of this belonging to anyone else, the scientist explained, is less than 1 in a trillion. Witnesses were called to the stand. Kevin Ross admitted that fear had kept him silent 19 years ago, but he now told the truth. He had seen Eric near the warehouse that night. Linda Clark testified, too, saying she had seen a man matching Eric's description near the gas station. Both witnesses trembled as they spoke, but their words echoed through the courtroom. The prosecution connected the pieces one by one: the video, the DNA, the witnesses, the car with the dent, the confession Eric had whispered during interrogation. Together, they painted a picture of guilt that was hard to deny. When it was the defense's turn, Eric's lawyer argued that the technology could not be trusted. He claimed that artificial intelligence was flawed, that it could create errors, that it was too new to be believed. He suggested that Eric's confession was forced by pressure, not truth. He argued that 19 years was too long, that memories had faded, that witnesses were unreliable. The jury listened, but the weight of the evidence was heavy. The AI-enhanced DNA and the multiple confirmations were not so easy to dismiss. Throughout the trial, Eric sat silently. Sometimes he glanced at the Bennetts, but he quickly looked away when Margaret's eyes met his. She stared at him not with anger, but with a sorrow so deep it felt like it could drown him. Daniel's eyes, however, burned with rage. Henry remained steady, his silence carrying more weight than any words. Chloe Martin, the young analyst who had worked tirelessly on the AI system, was also called to testify. She explained the process in simple words, describing how the AI worked as a tool to help investigators see what they could not see before. She told the jury, "The machine didn't create new evidence. It revealed what was already there. It allowed us to see the truth more clearly." Her calm explanation helped the jury understand that technology was not magic. It was clarity. As the days passed, the courtroom became a place of both pain and healing. Each detail brought back memories for the Bennetts, but each detail also brought them closer to justice. Margaret cried quietly when Laura's necklace was presented as evidence. Daniel clenched his jaw when Eric's past lies were revealed. Henry closed his eyes and prayed as witnesses spoke. Finally, after weeks of testimony, closing arguments began. The prosecutor stood before the jury one last time. 19 years ago, Laura Bennett was silenced, but today her voice is heard through evidence, through truth, and through justice. Do not let her wait be in vain. The defense argued again that doubt still existed, that time had made the case unclear, but their words felt thin compared to the strength of the evidence. The jury left to deliberate. Hours passed as the Bennetts waited in silence. Margaret whispered prayers under her breath. Daniel paced the hall, restless. Henry sat still, his hands folded. Samuel Price stood nearby, watching over them, his face calm but his heart tense. At last, the jury returned. The courtroom grew quiet as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Eric Turner, guilty of murder. The words echoed through the room. Margaret gasped and pressed Laura's necklace against her lips. Henry closed his eyes, a single tear falling down his cheek. Daniel's fists finally relaxed as he let out a long breath. After 19 years, justice had spoken. Eric sat motionless, his face drained of color. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged it off. The man who thought he had escaped forever now faced life behind bars. The judge announced the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was filled with the sound of quiet sobs, whispers, and relief. As Eric was led away, Margaret whispered, "It's over, Laura. It's finally over." Her voice trembled with both grief and peace. Daniel placed an arm around her shoulders. Henry reached for her hand. Together they sat as a family, no longer waiting for answers, but finally holding justice in their hands. Outside, reporters gathered to capture the moment. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded forward. Detective Samuel Price spoke briefly. "This case shows us that time does not erase truth. With patience, persistence, and new technology, justice can be found, even after nearly 2 decades. Chloe stood beside him, quietly proud but humble. She knew the AI was only a tool, but she also knew it had given voice to a victim long forgotten. The trial of Eric Turner became a symbol of how the past and the future could work together. Human determination and technological progress had joined hands to bring closure to a grieving family. For the Bennetts, no sentence could bring Laura back, but knowing the man responsible would never walk free gave them peace they had thought impossible. That night, Margaret lit the candle by the window once again, but this time it was not a candle of mourning. It was a candle of remembrance, a flame of love, and a symbol of justice finally served. The trial was over, and the verdict was final. Eric Turner was sentenced to spend the rest of his life behind bars. For the Bennetts, 19 years of waiting had finally ended. But justice, even when served, does not erase pain. It cannot bring back a daughter, a sister, a life that was stolen too soon. What it did bring was peace, a quiet sense that the long silence was finally broken and the truth had spoken at last. Margaret Bennett stood outside the courthouse with Henry and Daniel. By her side, reporters surrounded them, their microphones stretched out, their cameras flashing. Margaret spoke softly, her voice trembling but clear. "We waited for 19 years, and we never gave up hope. Laura was our daughter, our joy, and our light. Today she finally has justice." Her words brought tears to many listening. Henry placed an arm around her shoulder, steadying her. Daniel stood tall, though his eyes still burned with a mix of sadness and anger. For him, the victory felt hollow but necessary. That evening, back at their home, the family sat together at the kitchen table. The candle by the window burned as it always had on anniversaries, but this time, its flame seemed brighter. Margaret held Laura's necklace in her hand, rubbing the small pendant with her thumb. Henry spoke quietly, saying, "We can finally rest now, Margaret. We can finally breathe." Daniel listened, his jaw tight. He was grateful, but deep inside, he still wished things had been different. He still wished the police had solved it sooner, before 19 years of pain had passed. Detective Samuel Price returned to his office that night. He looked over the files one last time. The boxes that once carried nothing but dead ends were now filled with evidence that had spoken clearly. The AI reports, the enhanced video stills, the DNA matches, all of it told a story that had been waiting to be uncovered. He thought about the detectives before him, Harold Grant and Linda Monroe, who had carried the case in their time, but had been limited by the tools of the past. He wished they could have seen this day. Chloe Martin sat at her desk, too, staring at the glowing screen of her computer. She felt a mix of pride and humility. The AI had been the key, but she knew it was not the machine alone that solved the case. It was the persistence of people, the Bennetts who never stopped asking for justice, the detectives who refused to let the file stay forgotten, and the community that carried Laura's memory. She reminded herself that technology was a tool, but it was humans who gave it purpose. In the weeks that followed, Laura's story spread across the country. News programs spoke of the case as a symbol of how technology could bring light to old shadows. Headlines read, "AI solves 19-year-old murder," and "Justice found through technology." Some celebrated the progress, while others debated the risks of machines becoming part of justice. But for the Bennetts, None of the debates mattered. What mattered was that their daughter's name was no longer just written on the cold case wall at the police station. It was spoken in court, spoken in truth, and connected to justice. Eric Turner adjusted to life behind bars. The walls of his cell were a far cry from the freedom he had lived with for so many years. He replayed the past in his mind, wondering if things might have been different if he had walked away that night instead of letting anger guide him. But regret could not change the truth. He was no longer just an ordinary man hiding in plain sight. He was the face of a crime that had been solved after almost 2 decades of silence. The town of Ridgefield changed too. People who remembered, Laura spoke of her again. At the local church, candles were lit in her honor. At the school where she had once studied, her picture was placed in the hall with words that read, "Forever remembered." Her story became more than a tragedy. It became a lesson that truth, no matter how long it sleeps, will one day rise. For Daniel, closure was harder. He often visited his sister's grave standing in silence, speaking words only he could hear. Sometimes he asked her for forgiveness for not being able to protect her. Other times he promised her that he would carry her memory forward. Slowly, though, the anger that had lived inside him began to soften. Justice had not erased the pain, but it had given him a path toward healing. Margaret and Henry found comfort in small things again. Margaret tended her garden, planting flowers in Laura's favorite colors. Henry built a wooden bench and placed it near the yard, calling it Laura's seat. They sat there in the evenings, holding hands, watching the candlelight from the window flicker. It was their way of keeping her close. Detective Samuel was honored by the department for his work, but he never saw it as his alone. He often spoke about Chloe and the role technology had played. He said, "The machine did not solve the case for us. It gave us the eyes to see what had always been there. But it was people, the family, the witnesses, the team, that turned those details into justice." His words reminded others that technology should not replace humanity, but serve it. Chloe received recognition too. Universities invited her to speak about the power of AI in solving cold cases. She spoke about Laura, about the Bennetts, and about the importance of remembering the people behind the data. She always ended her talks by saying, "Technology is not about numbers. It's about stories. Stories like Laura's that deserve to be told and remembered." As time moved forward, Laura's story continued to inspire others. More cold cases were reopened using AI. Families who had waited years for answers felt hope again. Some cases were solved, others remained mysteries, but the spark of possibility had been lit. For the Bennetts, life slowly found rhythm again. They never forgot Laura, but they learned to carry her memory with peace instead of only sorrow. Margaret often said, "She is still with us in every flower that blooms, in every candle that burns." Henry nodded, believing that justice had finally given their daughter rest. Daniel, though slower to heal, began to speak of Laura not only with pain, but with pride. He remembered her laughter, her kindness, and her dreams. He carried those memories forward like a torch. 19 years had been long, painful, and unfair. But in the end, truth had been uncovered, justice had been served. And the name Laura Bennett was no longer just a story of loss. It was a story of resilience, love, and the power of never giving up. The flame in the Bennett window burned brighter than ever. It no longer stood only for grief. It stood for remembrance, for justice, and for the belief that even in the darkest corners, light can be found again. Calm but suspenseful tone, background music fading out. You've just seen one story, but there are many more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe to Crime Loom to watch more true crime stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't miss what's coming next, because every crime hides a story,